Welcome. All righty then. Hey, the mic's even on today. Good for you. All right. Well, as always, we will start with turn off your cell phones, please. I don't see any millennials in this room, so I assume you can go for an hour and a half without a phone, okay? Please do that. All right, tomorrow, Wisdom Wednesday. It's at 2:30 to 4 right here on this stage. And that will be coloring your way through Alabama's capitals with Laura Murray. Now, Laura Murray is an author and an illustrator. And as you may know, it's become incredibly popular for adult coloring books. I think that's a fun and relaxing hobby. And I think also that it ties in really well with last week's presentation on Wisdom Wednesday, which you may remember was of goats and governors. So just think of the fun you can have coloring prison bars on the governor's mansion. All right. We have Ollie Game Night. Well, unfortunately, it's from 3 to 5, so I don't think that really qualifies as night. But anyway, that is at Sunny Slope, and that is on February 28th. Bring your favorite board game or card game and join the fun. Ursula will be providing light refreshments, and you may wish to bring your own beverage. Nothing says fun with a board game like hard liquor. So, all right. Tuskegee Day Trip. Tuskegee Day Trip, that will be on March 20th from 8:15 a.m. till 3 p.m. You will see tours of the Tuskegee Airmen Museum, the Legacy Museum at Tuskegee University. Lunch is, unfortunately, Dutch treat at the Kellogg Hotel and Conference Center, and registration forms are out on the table out there, and this is limited to 25 people. And I think this is a really great opportunity to see this museum, which pays tribute to African-American aviators who were able to overcome prejudice at home to go on and make a great contribution to the U.S. military during World War II. So I think that's a very worthwhile trip. Well, speaking of World War II, you may know that June 6th of this year will be the 75th anniversary of the invasion of Normandy, which we refer to commonly as D-Day. Well, if you should go to Normandy for that event or any event in the future, I would strongly recommend that you take a little side trip to a town that's very close to the British and Canadian beaches called Bayeux. And at Bayeux, you will find an incredible relic from the Middle Ages, and that is the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, the Bayeux Tapestry is actually not a tapestry. It is indeed a hand-sewn embroidery. But regardless, it depicts the events of 1066 when William the Conqueror invaded England. So we're going to invade Normandy now that he's going to invade England. Of course, that was a little bit earlier. But the fact of the matter is this is an incredible relic, and it is indeed one of the only pieces of its kind that is secular. So I would highly recommend seeing this. And the other thing is, it's amazing that this piece has survived so long. It was actually going to be taken in 1944 by Heinrich Himmler to Berlin for, in quotes, safekeeping. Now, considering that Berlin was being bombed on a regular basis and was then flattened by the Red Army in 1945, I'm not so sure that it would have been particularly safe. But in the French Revolution, the tapestry had the sad event of being used by the revolutionaries as a cover for wagons. It's really big, by the way. It's 220 feet long by about 4 feet high, and used as a cover for wagons. And I've heard reports as much that part of it was used as a horse blanket. So what that really goes to say is that one man's horse blanket is another's middle-aged treasure. So, with that said, it is now my pleasure to introduce a man who will weave a tapestry of knowledge, dare I say, sew up the loose threads of history, Dr. Joseph Kicklighter.
You just never know. Thanks. You never know. You never know until the last. He saves it. He saves it. That tapestry, yes. The weaving of the tapestry, it's coming. So I'll start weaving. And obviously Frank had read ahead because our subject is going to be the monarchies of France and England. And you'll note I don't say the nations of France and England because I don't think we're really ready for that. I don't think we're going to be ready for that in this class. I think essentially monarchies represent countries of which we know by those names. Localism, of course, is part and parcel of their world. But that said, France and England come as close as the Middle Ages can offer to the creation of nations. Lord knows there's not going to be a Germany and an Italy until the 19th century. So thanks to medieval circumstances, those states are very late in the game. But we know that the creation, at least, of France and England are very essential to medieval history. Starting off, of course, with the image of the French, the fleur-de-lis, at least until the French Revolution, when I'm afraid the fleur-de-lis was not too popular, representing as it did royalism. But let's face it, without the royals, there would never have been a France. France then begins with the Capetians, the Eastern Carolingians having died out, and Hugh Capet being the first. Of course, he would claim to be related to the Eastern Carolingians, but the truth is that he was Count of Paris and he would be elected king. And then as crowned king, this ruler of Paris, which I mean was a substantial area, as many of you have been through there, so you know. But still, when you think of all of France, it's a very, very small part. However, as you will notice from the photograph, we have the fellow down on his knees, and you think, oh, was he connected to the church perhaps in some way? Or was he just had a big bald spot? I can assure you, he was very, very church connected. The church, the Catholic Church, loves kings who are law and order supporters. We're big on law and order in the Catholic Church. And therefore, the idea of a Hugh Capet who was devoted to the faith and devoted to the monks and so forth and so on meant that the church would bless his coronation. And the nobles were agreeable so long as he knew his place. You're king, but you don't get in our way. And that, of course, will be the interesting story of the Capetian kings of France. But one other note, they would have sons until 1328. And I think that's just remarkable. I mean, I'm not a betting person, but you always have to wonder what are the odds on that happening for all of those generations from 987 to 1328. They would have sons, and not only that, but the sons would survive to succeed them. And they always had a spare, you know, a backup. Yeah, because, yeah, you can't count on the first one, you know, making it, you know. You know that for your insurance things. And yeah, I mean, yeah. So that, in effect, shows us that the church's betting on these kings was a good one for the interests of the church. Now, when we look at France, and I remind you, it may not be your France, because your France may be the France of Louis XIV, for example, as I know it is for somebody. And I'm thinking it's much more, by your time, much more united. Whereas, essentially, these various states are almost independent except nominal acceptance of a king. He doesn't get in our way and we don't get into his. And then you say, but what does he rule? You see the blue? There it is. You say, it ain't much, but it's home, it's ours. But you know, even there, they had some, what I'd call ornery folks. Even in that territory. It's remarkable, isn't it? You think, wow, our county's the new king. Let's get down, and we just really respect him. We're such fans. No, many of them are rebellious, and we are told in the tales of these early kings that despite the admonitions of the church, because remember, if you go against the church, you know what may happen to you. The big E. Yes, excommunication. Yeah. And so, there could be trouble in Paris. A lot of hurt feelings. But that doesn't seem to affect them too much. At least I'm not aware of it. That in the chronicles that are written by churchmen, we are told about these wicked knaves, nobles, who will rebel against their ordained king. And no doubt they have burned ever since. Let's look, though. Again, these are territories many of you have been to. Toulouse, Aquitaine, up in Bordeaux, and down there in Gascony and Brittany, Celtic peoples. And there's one Frank mentioned, Normandy, and then you see Anjou. And look up at Flanders, Belgium, and Burgundy over there in the east. So there are amazing names, territories that maintained those names until 1790, when France created its departments. We kept our states, but they went to the department system to make uniform geographical administrative areas. But maybe thanks to the wine, or maybe thanks to medieval studies, we remember all of these various traditional names of these areas. And in each of them, there is their own ruler, whether he's a duke from the Latin leader, or count, whatever he may be, and he has a set of lords under him, and I'm sure they face the same deal. Everybody has to control everybody, right? Because that's what we do. We fight, and we try to keep control. What does that leave the king with? It leaves him with trying to get things settled back home. Because you don't take on all of France. I mean, for Europe, France is a rather large area. And the French kings make up their minds that they are going to do, as they say in the commercials, job number one. And that is settle the Ile-de-France. That is the territory around Paris. And again, you can see that particular territory. We are told, of course, and we look at this, and it's easy for us to say now, because as we look at these different circumstances, remember, this is what historians looking back recognize, but I'm not sure the French kings knew that. You don't know you're going to have a surviving son. You don't know that you will have all of these various assets. But again, the kings had the church's devotion most of the time, because most of the time the kings would support the church, and therefore, I mean, it was a mutual relationship. And if the king sometimes had to use military means, we're sorry. But you hurt those you love sometimes. And so they'll thank you later. Merci, merci. I needed that. So yes, we understand then, there's that. And then you say, but what if a king sins against the flesh? Yes, I hate to bring that up. But I think we need to confront these issues straight up. If the king succumbs to this extramarital relationship, we think the church will understand. We have to take priorities. Priority is he's going to take care of the church. And that is secondary. People often ask me about that Charlemagne and his strew of concubines. I mean, you know, that's why monks pray for kings. They need a lot of prayer, okay? So we know that. We've got 24/7 prayer service. So it's not that, but it's to understand that we have bigger problems than the king's bedroom to be concerned about. And if kings are knocking bad people around, that's job number one, okay? Just so you don't think that these kings are all angels, for they're certainly not. Now, there's also, of course, the feudal principle, which I think is always interesting. You may remember the first talk I mentioned suzerain, and that means head of the head of the head of the, and you have the so-called hierarchy or the feudal pyramid or whatever you want to call it. In this case, the great vassals, like Duke of Burgundy or Duke of Aquitaine, whatever he may be, they were the vassals in chief. But to make it even more complicated, you have the big vassals and then you have the little vassals, because he has vassals in the Ile-de-France. So I call them the little vassals, the mini vassals. And then you have the big vassals. And then the big vassals have middle vassals, and then the middle vassals have little vassals. And we all, I know, but we all have lots of peasants, okay? Everybody has that. So yeah. So there's a place for everybody. Don't worry about that. But understand, this whole vassalage thing can get really confusing. Wouldn't you think you would want to have some monks or somebody to keep up with your schedule, you know, your to-do list? Because if you were a vassal, how many different possible lords you might have in terms of feudal obligations. But somehow they were able to manage that, these various rulers, and as I noted, 1328, which we will eventually get to in the spring, that will be the end of the line for the Capetians. Louis the Fat, Louis the Sixth, is the first one that we know a lot about. And the reason we know a lot about him is he had his own biographer. Isn't that neat? Yeah. And of course you say, oh, I wonder if it's a critical biography. Indeed not. It is loving. And you say, but he calls him fat. That's just ugly. No, it's not. That's a compliment. If you are able in this period to have some extra pounds, you are doing mighty well. Yes, indeed. Most folks are slender and they don't pick that choice, okay? You don't choose to be thin. You're thin because you don't get much to eat. So a big old boy like Louis was known as the fat, and I cannot believe the Abbé Suger, who was a great clergyman of the time, and I might say he was clergyman in residence. He was there with the king, and so it's sort of like the deeds, I was there, sort of writing to Louis' son, saying, "You're dead." That sort of memoir. Now, the book that I recommended refers to him as a mediocrity, and I disagree with that, but I guess it's a matter of opinion. Certainly, according to Suger, he spends a lot of time, in fact, most of the time, creating a kind of law and order for the ill, trying to keep his vassals suppressed and obedient, at the same time enjoying great support from the church. And you say, oh, you mean prayers? Yeah, but I want something else, okay? Something more solid on the earth. Temporal goods, if you get my drift. And we got to pay those horse expenses and such, and weapons and things like that. And the church says, we love Louis. And so in this small area, Louis is enjoying tremendous support. Does this mean everything is perfect? No. But it means that they have this goal of maintaining order in the ill and showing the great nobles of the rest of France that he is to be considered. Some of you perhaps have seen the Abbé Suger's church. It's called Saint-Denis. And of course, St. Denis was the legendary disciple of St. Paul. It's now, I think, in a sort of a rougher suburb of Paris, but it used to be the place where you could go until the French Revolution, where they buried the remains of the French kings and queens. But during the Revolution, they decided to remove the remains of the kings and queens in a forcible way. Not a polite way, okay? So that was lost, but it was very odd because at the time I went to see it, I looked right across, I had my little camera, and right across the street there was the French Communist Party and headquarters, and I thought, I said, I just think, boy, I think Suger might not have been comfortable with having Trotskyites or whatever right next to Saint-Denis, but it was a very, very significant ecclesiastical facility. Again, we don't know how much time he actually spent there because I'm sure he was busy. He was sort of like the King's National Security Advisor or something of that sort, you know. He was a big deal, and you say, can the clergy do this for the laity? I mean, shouldn't they be involved strictly in the pursuits of the Lord? Well, it is the Lord's work in a certain way. You know, they had it figured out. Don't worry. Don't worry. They knew what they were doing. And so, His record as being a great royal advisor was wonderful until he got the idea of choosing a wife for Louis the Fat's son. He said, "Sire, you know, there is an interesting situation down in Aquitaine. There, the Duke does not have a son, but he has only a daughter. Well, of course, that makes the king lick his chops, because the idea is my son marries his daughter and we get this enormous wealthy territory." Think wine. Okay, think lots of wine. Aquitaine then, as now, is both beautiful and very productive. I'm sure there are many other crops, but wine is the one that immediately comes to mind. Meanwhile, we know that this particular wedding turned out to be a very unfortunate one. If, as is true, Eleanor said, "I thought I'd married a man, but I've married a monk," I'm really not sure, but because I think there's a lot more to it. In any event, like most medieval women, she did not have a lot of choices in terms of a spouse. This was all political between his father and her father. And they say she was probably very sad to go north. And you go to Paris makes you sad. Well, they say if you were in Bordeaux back then and you compared it to what Paris was like, because I understand that until maybe Napoleon III in the 19th century, the Paris, at least most of the time, that we know of and like to go as tourists did not exist. Paris was a dark, kind of ugly place. I mean, it was growing to be important and larger in population than certainly most places in the West. But the story is that she was unhappy in Paris and she did not enjoy being Queen of France. As a prospect, however, she was number one, and the king, that is to say Louis VI, was not prepared to let anyone else have her, since she was going to get the duchy. Now, if she'd had a brother, whole nother story. But that's not the case. The case was that this made the future King of France Duke of Aquitaine. Whether or not his bride liked it, right? That, you know, we understand that. As many of you have read before, I'm sure, Eleanor was well-educated, bright, and quite an individual who's going to be involved. In fact, while if you did a study of the various English queens and French queens, as far as I know, she's one about whom the most is written. And you all know the old thing about, we know the most about the women in history who don't follow the rules. And so that's certainly true of Eleanor, because she does not in any way go about what she was supposed to do. Now, eventually this term we'll get to the Crusades and talk about her in that connection. But for the time being, I will simply note that she and her husband, and again, this is very odd. Normally, we don't think of Crusades as being coeducational, do we? But she went, and there was all kinds of talk about her infidelity on Crusades. And I know. Try not to be shocked. It's upsetting. But by the time they were getting home, there was more and more talk about an annulment. Now we think, why not divorce? Oh, no. We don't do the divorce. Incompatibility, yes, I guess that would have worked, but nope. We've got to have some relative in common. So get the royal genealogist to work. We want this. We got a deadline. Got a meeting with papal representatives. And seriously, it must have gotten through the bureaucracy pretty fast. Now, you understand, they had daughters, Eleanor and her husband, Louis VII. They were not without children, but they didn't have a son. Now, I'm just telling you, it's my opinion that that's why Louis VII was ready to move on. I mean, we just have so many years, and she has not had the son yet, and there are lots of eligible younger women. Whatever happened on the so-called Second Crusade, we'll never know. I don't know, though, what Louis VII had on his mind, if anything, because, in fact, she went back to Bordeaux, which meant Louis VII was no longer going to be Duke of Aquitaine, right? Because when the marriage is annulled, Mr. X, you're no longer the Duke. Now, you're going to be her lord. She'll be your vassal, right? I mean, she'll be the ruler of Aquitaine. It's hers. Community property. Settle. Yeah. So, but I don't think it affects the legitimacy of the children. And I know all you bright people, you're thinking, but wait, if it's annulled, that means they were never really married, so doesn't that make the children boo-boos? No, we don't do it. We don't do it that way, okay? No, children are, yes, they are legitimate. It was all just a misunderstanding. And those are nice, and those were really nice children. And you know, they were poets, writers, supporters of the courtly love, like their mother. So, you think, well, then Eleanor can settle down. No, she doesn't. She gets out there on, you know, I guess in today's terms, she'd be online, one of those dating sites. Yeah. See who's out there, who's Mr. Eligible. And who else would it be but, of course, the King of England and Duke of Normandy, King Henry II, which created one of the most interesting, if stormiest marriages that some of us will remember from Katharine Hepburn and Peter O'Toole, which I think was an interesting combination. Henry, again, in terms of a central medieval High Middle Ages ruler, is certainly going to be one of the most interesting. 1154 to 1189, that's a long time. And he was with her, ruled with her as Duchess of Aquitaine and now Queen of England for a very long time. And that's how the two histories kind of come together. But as Frank has already pointed out, we have to go back to the Norman conquest to really appreciate how far and how close Anglo-French ties are. So I want to go back to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And by the way, there is another class that deals with this in considerable detail, and you are certainly welcome. These kingdoms go back to, gee, I imagine you could say that's probably the 10th century when those various kingdoms, before King Alfred, because the Danes brought most of that to an end, and he helps them tidy up a bit, because there's Wessex, down south, you see West Saxons, so that will become the essence of the new kingdom of England as it will develop. And you know how the Danes will come down and take over most of what had been Anglo-Saxon. However that may be, this period, of course, of King Alfred the Great, and I used to say that in the past, certainly not in the 21st century, but the 20th century, some of us remember that, they knew who Alfred was. That's like going to school and saying, now let's name our presidents. And they would look at you and say, what? but in the day, English school children knew all about Alfred. He was there, George. Well, I know, thank you. I'm so glad other people realize. It's so annoying when they look back at me and say, huh, are you sure? I say, yes, I'm positive. I wasn't there, but I'm positive they knew who Alfred was. I mean, only one of those famous people in English history. And so, yeah, times have changed. But we can't stop on that note of sadness. Let us go on and simply note that this king of Wessex becomes, according to the usual renditions, the first true king of England. And he will rule in the latter part of the 10th century. All of this is to say that by the Norman conquest in that famous year, 1066, the English, so-called, had not had a lot of time to develop before they would be taken over, of course, by the French, or at least the Norman version of the French. The Normans, of course, are Norse, so I guess you would have to say, as we do in the South, they were kissing cousins. They were, you know, these folks are all related. I would just call them big blondes coming south. Some came to what we call Britain, that is the Danes. The Normans, the Norse, coming into France and establishing what is known as Normandy. And this big old Norman went to the early French king and said, I want your daughter and I want to be your vassal. I mean, this big old blonde thug, scary. He said, okay, oui. So, I mean, yeah, you're not gonna disagree with him. And that's how this Norman duchy began. You always think it must have been something lovely and elegant with a beautiful service. But it's more or less you have some pipsqueak Carolingian, Western Carolingian. They'd come a long way since Charlemagne downward. And he says, and this big gang of Normans come and demand recognition. And so they get the Duchy of Normandy and the king's daughter. So the story goes. Normandy, and I know, well, obviously Frank and Linda, and I'm sure others of you have been to Normandy and seen these lands. Even if you are not a World War II aficionado, there is so much to see there because Normandy, as one scholar tells it, was sort of the birthplace of medieval civilization. It's interesting to think about. And next week, as a matter of fact, our subject is going to be medieval intellectual accomplishments. And much of it will come out of Norman patronage and Norman churchmen. Because remember, all of this has to do with church-sponsored activities if we want to do anything that pertains to reading and studying, in addition to prayer. So, all of this leads us to William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, who was, as all the chronicles agree, a very tough fellow. I don't think he's, but again, you would not expect someone who would become King of England and Duke of Normandy to be a sweet and affable fellow. He was tough, and he claimed, with some reason, that he was the logical heir to the English throne. As interesting as that tale is, I will simply note that his family was associated with that of the current king's mother. And so there is a relationship. If we looked at a tree, we could see this connection. But suffice it to say, they were tied. William also cleverly made an understanding with the Pope of that day. And who would that Pope be? Gregory VII. I hope you remember him from last week. Knowledge is for a lifetime, not for one day. Your mind, like that of Napoleon, is like a chest of drawers. And all you need to do is pull out the medieval file, and it's there. Just remember that. I'll be asking you to pull out that medieval drawer again and again during the next few weeks. So that's easy enough. Make sure those hinges are go back and forth. Gregory VII, you say, well, why would he be interested in England and Normandy? I'll tell you exactly why. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the English Church, was at that point, I'm going to use a bad word, schismatic. Yeah, I know. It really brings you down, doesn't it? Yeah, see, to be schismatic means you are not in tune with Rome. He had, see, he brought her, you see, poor soul. I mean, she's down now. Basically, this man was a puppet of English factions. He had not been consecrated with Roman approval. So, William's representatives with Gregory VII said, we love you, and if we conquer England, you know, we could help straighten out this situation, this schism. And so Gregory's mind, of course, just, oh, wow, this sounds wonderful. Could I help? Yes. We could use a nice check or some other things. So, yeah, I mean, the accounts of the conquest will be replete with, there are all kinds of relics that the Normans will have on their ships over to England. And the banner of St. Peter, it's like our team. You know, this is the Peter group, and that sort of thing. So it's very much supported, this Norman conquest, by the papacy. And none other than our Gregory VII. And you say, well, he's probably... And you say, is he as concerned about this as he is about those Germans? I don't think so. The Germans are a whole lot closer and messing with us. But it's interesting, and his representatives are right there. And believe you me, they'll try to cash in. You know, they got that IOU there, and after William becomes King of England, they're going to say, remember us, banner of St. Peter, relic bestower. We're ready to cash in. Yeah? Just please understand that. It's like, gosh, we just stand, we'll wait, we'll be quiet, you know, we don't bother you. No, we want our stuff and we want it. So that's William. And he does things, believe me, that the Pope is not necessarily going to like. And for example, you'll notice bishops doing fealty and homage. Now, you know, he would have told Henry IV, now again, I'm going to try my German, 9? No? Is that okay? Yeah, you can't do that. You can't get bishops down before you to do those vows. But in England, it's a long ways away. And he can't just get on his plane and enforce his order. So he said, gosh, I wish we could work this out, but I love you so much. So yeah, that's better. Because he wants to have that connection, England and the papacy. And he does. And perhaps because of the papacy and perhaps because of lots of good marriages, the English under William and leading up to William's great-grandson, and that's what he was, Henry II. He was the great-grandson. And again, you say, but what about all the others? We're trying to cut it short here, you know, get everything in. So, as interesting as it is, I'm biting my tongue to not get into as much detail. All of this, see, parts of Ireland, as you can see, and I think you've heard that expression, beyond the pale. That comes from the idea of, you know, if you're part of Henry II's forces and you go beyond that brown area, whoa, it's trouble. See? But they know you're English, and that isn't good. So even back then, there's that Anglo-Irish business. Again, you look York, you see Carlisle there at the border. That's about as far as they got. But it's not that Henry II wasn't trying. He was indeed a very, very busy man. One of his biographers talks about, would that he spent as much time in prayer as he did in conquest. I don't think they could barely keep him in church through the Eucharist to receive the sacrament. I mean, the priest was probably following him with the bread and wine, you know, because that was a man on the go, because he had a whole lot of conquering to do. And you see the territories he ruled. Through his wife, he had that beautiful Aquitaine and south, Guyenne or Gascony, as they say, all the way down, you see, to Bayonne. The territory you see in the north came through his father and mother, Anjou and Normandy. And as a result of that, we talk about having an empire. Notice that term, the Angevin Empire, because he would now be the ruler of Anjou, Angevin. You say, but an empire, so there was an imperial headquarters? No, none of that, I'm afraid. It simply means the King of England has those other territories. And one of the basic points, which I'm sure you already know, but it's so hard to explain to the dear undergraduates, that they held the other possessions as a vassal. You can't go to Normandy and say, I'm the king around here. Well, no, you're not. You're a duke. And don't you forget it. You save that king business when you're across the English Channel, buddy. In other words, it's a very odd situation to think about. You got to make sure you know where you are in order to get the titles right. And you can't come in and say, well, in England we do it this way. Well, you're not in England, loser. You're in Anjou. Don't you forget it. We got Angevin pride. So, yeah, it's very important. Each part will have its own laws, history, tradition. They just happen to share a common ruler. And they now have a break. How long is it? 3 minutes? 4 minutes? I forget. They tell me how.
Whatever you think.
Whatever, yeah. I'll see you when you get back. But remember, when the lights start flickering, you better be here. Okay? Yeah. You're in your seat, ready for instruction. Okay, can we go now? All right, the break is over now. Like, you've had all of this secular time. Okay, now back to prayers. So, I do not know what that aquamarine area that looks like a body of water, and I'm worried and concerned, and if anyone can identify it, you'll get extra credit. And some of you may need that, you know. So just remember that if you are trying to get an A in here and are not content with a B+, not mentioning names. But just note that this area is what we call the Angevin Empire, but that is simply in the historian's lexicon of terms. That is to say, Henry II didn't know it was the Angevin Empire. That's what's so funny about a lot of these things, that, you know, if you found him in purgatory, you ran him down and said, well, what about your Angevin Empire? And he'd say, I didn't realize I had that. That's nice. Because there was nothing systematic about this. And in many ways, it's sort of like a one and only deal. I mean, he has it, but no one else follow him, as we will see. He is, as I've said, the great-grandson. We associate him of William the Conqueror, and we associate him with many of the greatest advances of the government, including the exchequer and the codification of common law and royal judges to enforce it throughout the realm. These accomplishments, of course, are not, I suspect, what he would want to be remembered for, because he spent much of his time as a warrior, fighting, oddly enough, with his own lord, who was in fact Louis VII, his predecessor as Eleanor's husband, which sounds odd, but I guess considering the fact that he was King of France and that Henry's primary goals might have been to conquer as much of the territory. I remember reading once about he was attacking, that is Henry, he was leading an army attacking the area around Toulouse. And someone must have come out and said, do you know who's in here, Louis? He said, uh-oh, I shouldn't be doing this. Because that's very rude. I mean, if it's your lord, you shouldn't be attacking. That's a no-no. You know, you could be defeudalized, I think, for that. You lose all your... Because, I mean, technically, sir... Yes, you would be seriously contumacious. Thank you. I want to, yeah. To be contumacious is to lose all your feudal credentials. And that's embarrassing. To be more or less attacking your own lord, you just don't do that. But you can do it in other ways. Send somebody else in your place. But you just don't do it, in person because you're breaking your vows. So, according to the feudal rules, that's just not to be done. And you say, why France? Well, I always like to tell people they spoke French, they acted French, they spent most of the time in France. We're going to have to wait a while, right, Carol, to come back to being English. And I would say Henry V, but I may be a little late. Do you want to go back earlier to be English? I mean, the reason I say Henry V is because I actually saw a letter that he wrote in English, Henry V, in the 15th century, and I thought that was so interesting because I would think most people, and Henry II was very well educated, and he would have known French and Latin, but I'm not sure he knew English. I would rather doubt it. In any event, most of his time would be spent in France, not in Aquitaine, probably hanging out with his mom in Normandy, because remember, that's how he inherited that. His mother was Matilda, and she was another famous character in this tale of Henry II and his accomplishments. When he died in 1189, then, England, while being the major part of his holdings, was by no means the only part, but the one that most of us think of when we remember him. His foe after Louis VII was Louis VII's son. The fact that Louis VII had sons by later wives would indicate that the fact that they had daughters is simply, I guess, a matter of genetics. It's the only way I can explain it. But because by Henry, she will have 4 sons. Yeah, another one, and plus daughters. So they're very fertile. Whereas Philip II is the son of Louis VII by a subsequent wife. Believe me, he got over it. He dealt with his pain. He was out dating in no time. And I don't think it took a lot of days before he was married, and they had Philip II, who is known to history as Augustus, because, they say, he increased France. Philip II would be considered one of the most important of the French monarchs. And I don't think that's even a subject for debate or discussion in the sense that, are you really sure? I'm sure. He's the one in terms of the increase in territory and prestige, the destruction, of course, of enemy number one. And who is enemy number one? Whoever's king of England. That's the way they felt. Anyone who is king of France will truly have a case of Anglophobia. Okay? I mean, you think of, you hurt my dad. I don't want to get personal about this because I'm really not sure if they were worried about Dad's feelings. In many ways, I understand he was trying to uphold the reputation of his father, Louis VII. Because Louis VII had been humiliated by Henry II militarily and had to suffer. I mean, he was Henry II's Lord. Do you realize that? And yet, he certainly did not enjoy much as a result. And I guess I need to point that the Second Crusade was not exactly a happy time. If indeed she was unfaithful, and at the same time, they didn't carry out any of their goals, I would call the Second Crusade a big fizzle. So there are many ways that we would consider Louis VII to be a sad case. But now he can rejoice that his son, Philip II, is going to be a great success. Some of you, and we'll get into this later, will be aware that Philip II will go on what is called a Third Crusade with his cousin Richard the Lion-Hearted. And then once they get into the Middle East, somehow Philip will say, the doctor had said I have this chronic condition. Like a lot of people when they cut class, my health has failed. I have not been well. I may have to see a specialist. But Philip actually went back to Europe. And you're going like, I wonder if this is really true. But he went back, and really, Richard was left in many ways to deal with the crusading situation on that Third Crusade. However that may be, Philip II was always thinking about what he could do with the English, how he could get them out of France, and how he could ruin things for him. And of course, he had the perfect foil after King Richard, being King John. Yes, King John, no number. We don't need a number because there's only one John. And you'll notice, I don't care how many children William and Kate have, I don't think they're going to name any Johns. But if I'm wrong and there's a John II, I'll be really surprised. I will be very surprised. I think that name is mud. It certainly is in English history. And there have been books written, and I know a guy, very nice, down in Florida, who was a John person. It was like when John at medieval history meetings, and somebody would start bad-mouthing him, he would come up, and you would sort of try to be quieter and say, I didn't mean it like that. I mean, he had some really good points. He had a nice personality. And I think he loved his mother. And, sort of, you're always trying to think of something nice when you think of King John, because in so many ways he was so dreadful and such a loser and a flop. But you always want to think of everybody has some good points. And so we struggle here. Oddly enough, he seems to have been his father's favorite, which is interesting when you think about it. He was the baby, and Richard seemed to have been the favorite of Eleanor of Aquitaine, I guess. Each parent had different favorites. The true heir to the throne, who was also known as Henry, would not ever become king. He died beforehand. So Richard and John are the successors because they live. It's just a matter of happenstance when you think about it. But the fact is that for whatever reason, John was not successful. He lacked the characteristics that would have made a good king. And the sources from that time period confirm what I think the majority of historians believe. It's not to say that important things did not happen in the period, because certainly they did. We all know about it. We all know, for example, that when we think of English history, I mean, if you were to come up to a crowd of people when you arrive in London and Gatwick and say, do you have a copy of Magna Carta I could look at right now? Yeah, they might be a little surprised, but at least they would know what you're talking about, don't you think? Oh, you look a little, maybe not. I think most people know about Magna Carta, at least I like to think so. If not, I'm sure they don't know about John's unfortunate marital situation. John's marriage, first marriage, was not a satisfactory one. And in case anyone's interested, it was Isabel of Gloucester, but I don't know why anybody would be. But he was going to marry again, and apparently he was looking at some people who were probably distantly related. You know how that happens. That's why you get so many annulments arranged by the church. They can always find a connection if you look hard enough and go back enough generations. In any event, a funny thing happened on the way to Spain. He met someone in France. The individual that he picked was also named Isabella, and she was the daughter of one of John's vassals, which is fine. But she was already engaged. I mean, she was getting up there, 13, 14. I mean, it was high time, you know. I mean, my goodness, how long do you want to wait? So she was already engaged to another vassal. And at first, when you hear that story, I don't know whether you're more shocked by the age or you're more shocked by the fact that John would suddenly sing with the strings of my heart or something like that. But then when you get over your romantic inclinations, personally, I think it has to do with political opportunism. I know it's shocking, and I'm sorry to have to be the one to break it to you this way. I feel like I've put a pin in a balloon of love. But those lands of the man who was going to marry what bordered or joined the land of the woman's father. And so maybe John wanted to bust this up by taking the land himself through marriage to Isabel. I don't know. No one does. But we do know this, that after John did it, because what is the vassal going to say? He's going to say, no, sire, I'm sorry, I really would like for my daughter to marry you. No, he's going to say, shoot, yeah, this will be great. We've already got the caterer ready, and you know, we're going to send out the invitations, and we'll just scratch the name out and put in your name. No, I mean, you know, they were saying he was, you know, happy as a lark. But the ex-groom is unhappy. His heart is broken. He sits, there are violins playing, yes. He is moaning there with the chocolate and the Hallmark cards, all of that, and thinking, we were so close. I think, again, I'm cynical, but I tend to think that it is very much about power and control. I hate to. But if it is, that would explain, and Hugh the Brown is his name, and he actually went to Philip II to complain. Not complain like, oh, my heart is broken. It's not an Abbey kind of thing. It's more a sort of like, legally, John is in the wrong. He violated my rights. She was mine. You say, possessions? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Marriage is some serious legal business. Those who are married will understand this. I mean, it's not like we're just fluttering through this. It's two hearts beating as one. Please, don't give me that. I want some land. I want something coming out of this. So yes, indeed, my feelings have been hurt and slighted. I'm a wounded vessel. So I want some respect. Philip then said, thank you, Lord. You have given me the blessing that I wanted. And the blessing will be, in effect, that John will lose most of his French lands. He will lose them, Frank, because he's contumacious. Yes, that's our word for the whole term. If you don't remember anything else, you'll remember being contumacious. None of you would ever be contumacious. You're just too nice. the people who are contumacious violate feudal law. And you never marry a fellow vassal's fiance. Okay, so that's a no-no, taboo. It would take time for all of this to take place. John never acknowledges it. He never goes to Paris and says, I know, and I'm really sorry. You understand, he always hoped against hope until the final loss in 1214 that he would be able to get back these lands. The French did not have the wherewithal to take Aquitaine, meaning military power, but they got Normandy, the French, and they got Anjou. They were saying, I read this, that the students at Paris were just in ecstasy over the French victory. I don't know whether that's true or not, because there were probably a lot of international students, but whatever the case, and I'm thinking, I don't know if they would be too excited about Philip's victory. However, that is a milestone in French history when you think now those lands come under the direct rule of the French king. However, French kings can't really control all that land because we have creatures known as younger brothers, and they can be troubling. They love you, and they're terribly fond of you, and yet they can get ornery because they say, well, you get to be king, what can I have? Yes, they can be troubling, very troubling, and this will be the case for some of the French kings. So most of these territories will have to be held by kings' younger brothers and younger sons because, of course, they have their heir. And so you can't then say, well, you fellas, you all have hobbies, girlfriends, whatever, and you just enjoy life. Well, no, we want something tangible here. And this will lead to, as expected, conflict and lots of opportunities for fighting amongst them. I think this is interesting. This is a before and after picture of English France. And you say, wow, It was so nice in the late 12th century. What happened? Who ate it up? There goes the Angevin Empire. You look at the red. Look at all that pretty red. And all of that was once the land of the King of England. Again, now, while you say it's held by the French, please understand that it will often be younger members of the French king's family who will have authority. But if one of them makes a slip up, remember, we can always step in and take it back, like becoming contumacious, whatever it might be. Yeah, that happens even in the nicest of families. These Capetians can be ugly to each other. And you say, well, shoot, look what he's got left. Well, that's still mighty nice. I mean, it doesn't look big, but yeah, if you like wine, yeah, that's some good land right there. Bordeaux and all of those areas, almost down to the Pyrenees. So, Magna Carta, of course, is the sort of major ending, not only of John's ruin, but also his life. He is going to die shortly thereafter, after battle. Another lack of success in his life. I mean, it's like, how many strikes can go on with this game? Magna Carta, as you were aware, I'm sure, in 2015 when we celebrated the anniversary, it was quite the deal. The Queen went out with her grandson, Prince William, and made the proclamations at Runnymede and so forth and so on. All of which is to say that John is certainly not lauded as a successful king, but events in his reign were certainly important for both England and France, and that's about the nicest we can say about him. As far as Magna Carta, he gets credit because it happened in his reign and because the major authorities couldn't put up with any more of his activities, including losing lands, taking away revenues from them, the nobles, the church, extortion, which is not nice, forced marriages. For example, if you were a noble woman and your husband died and you said, you know, I don't think I'm going to marry again. Well, I don't think we're going to give you that choice. We've decided you're going to marry again. And why are you going to marry again? You think I'm going to say love and chocolate? No, you're not. Because I'm not. I'm going to say it's all because you bring with you lots of thieves. And so kings could use forced marriages to bring their supporters massive lands. I don't know what the condition of the relationship was. I'll leave that to the Hallmark card composers. I would like to think they were beautiful, but I'm not so sure about that. I do know that lots of land was transferred that way, though, through forced marriages. The best thing, if you want to be a widow, I'm going to tell you, give you a little advice. Go to a convent and run for abbess, because then you can have, you can have power, you can study, and if any nun says, I'd like to take a break, I want to kick back, I want to chill, you can say, no, sister. You get back in there and get busy on that work, or you're going to do another lecture. You know, yeah, those are good times. But when John died, after Magna Carta, he died in 1216, we understand, of course, that we go back to France and see the rulers who are going to enjoy the benefits of Philip II. And one of them, Louis the Ninth, but you can call him St. Louis. Yeah, that's right. This is the one, Louis the Ninth. He is the grandson of Philip II, and he will actually be made a saint. His mother was Spanish. Blanche was her name, and she was actually the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And interesting genealogical connections, but I will spare you that. Simply note that she had quite a tradition, and I think I'll get back to her when I'm talking about the Inquisition and heresy, because she was seriously religious, very, very devoted to the church. And as such, Louis IX would try as best he could to be the ideal king, devoted to the church, devoted to his mother, and devoted to the task of carrying out the faith as he saw it. He did not reach out to people of different faiths, I might add. He was no friend to Jews and Muslims. He did go on crusade. Now, I might say, how was he with heretics? Not good. It was not like, let's all y'all come, let's all get together. Don't y'all love Jesus? Those people are trouble. Brand X, okay? Don't you get... And you say, what did his mother think? His mother said, A-okay, honey. A-okay, because a Castilian queen who had brought him up because he was mama's boy. His father, Louis VIII, had died when he was a child on crusade. And Louis IX then became emblematic of French authority. So much so that when his grandson sent word to the Pope, you know what? Granddad loved the church so much, and I'd like to maybe make a love offering. And you know what the Pope said? Your granddad was a saint. That's the truth. 1297 is his canonization date. He becomes St. Louis. Every royal family needs to have one. Don't you think? We need to have a saint. I will see you all next week, and we'll talk about medieval intellectual life. Thank you. Thank y'all.